Welcome to the Music Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Matthews. On today's show, we welcome Miss Pat Long, who is the orchestra director at Williston Middle School and New Hanover High School. She is joining us to talk about the orchestra. She will tell us a little about the makeup of an orchestra, the instruments involved, and how to participate in the orchestra. Then we will take an in-depth look at one of the orchestra's most famous instruments, the violin. And finally, we will see a performance from the New Hanover High School Orchestra. Stay tuned for more of the Music Show.
It's time for a flashcard math check. Get out your pencil and paper and get ready to test your math knowledge and multiplication. Are you ready? Here we go. Did you get the right answers? Well, let's find out. 9 times 6 equals 54. 2 times 5 equals 10. 8 times 8 equals 64. 4 times 9 equals 36. 3 times 4 equals 12. Keep working on those math skills and keep it tuned here to the Learning Network of the Cape Fear for more flashcard math checks brought to you by New Hanover County Schools.
Welcome back to the Music Show. I would like to welcome our guest, Pat Long, who's going to talk with us about the orchestra.
Thank you.
Pat.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you for coming. Where and when did the first orchestras begin?
Orchestras began in the courts of the princes, and they were made and set up for the musical pleasure of the princes or kings and queens, and they were very small ensembles. And then they started to grow after, in about the early 1700s, we started to get into some chamber orchestras. The Mannheim School was the first ones who actually took the orchestra out of the palace and started to make these huge orchestras and large sounds. And the operas, they played for the operas in Italy, and it really took off after that. They found they could do all kinds of neat things with the orchestra that they couldn't do. And they didn't have records, and they didn't have CD players, so that was their entertainment.
They didn't have iPods either, did they?
They did not have iPods.
Okay. Are there orchestras of different sizes? You said the orchestras, when they first came out of the court in the royal court systems, that they were small. Did they later, when they grew out of that, were they small, or did they start large, or have there been different sizes of orchestras?
They grew slowly. It was very costly, and without the prince or king's money coming into and keeping them going, they had to raise money on their own. So they started out small. Chamber orchestras are normally 40 or less people. The scores for the, let's say, a Baroque orchestra, and I have an example here of a Baroque score. You can see the instrumentation is half of a page. You have your flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, French horns, timpani, and then your violins, violin 1, 2, violas, cellos, and basses. This Baroque orchestra survived for quite a while until about 1750. And then we started to get into some classical music, Beethoven, Mozart, and this score takes this whole page. As a conductor, they would be sitting up here looking at this whole page of music for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 measures. So their scores would be extensive. The players normally would not see this score, they would just see their individual part. So you can see we've got doubles on a lot of the parts. We've added trumpets, trombones, tubas, a lot of different percussion instruments.
Okay. Now, you're talking about instruments. Were the different combination of instruments a standard, or was it based on the composer of the music?
A lot of composers were discovering instruments like the clarinet. And Beethoven loved the clarinet and put it in a lot of his music, but it was not in all of the composers. And certain composers had their favorites. And as new instruments were being developed, then they were able to expand the sounds that they were getting, like with the saxophone. You don't see much symphony music for saxophone, but there is some. And actually, coming into the 20th century, they started experimenting with all kinds of different sounds from electronic sources. And I know of a composer named Hovannes who actually used whale sounds as part of his percussive orchestration. So
it's very interesting.
it was real cool, yeah.
Huh.
It was really neat.
Now, what instruments are in the modern day orchestra?
In the modern, well, again, it depends on the piece of music that's being played, but this is the modern day orchestral setup. You have your first violins, and usually you'll have about 30 of them. Second violins, about the same amount. Your violas are sitting here, and your cellos and basses. Now, I have seen symphonies set up where the cellos and the second violins are reversed.
Okay.
The problem with that, for me as a conductor, is they are no longer in score order. As looking at a score and looking at its conductor, I can sweep across this way, and I have all of my instruments lined up. But where the cellos and the violins are switched, I have to cue now the cellos with my left hand rather than my right hand. And that takes a little bit of getting used to. You have your piano and harp, your percussion, timpani, trumpets, trombone, tubas, and then your French horns. You have your clarinets, oboes, flutes, and bassoons. So you've got quite a few instruments going on here.
Now the percussion, I'm going to assume they're in the back because they're very much louder than violins.
Right, they are.
Okay.
They'll carry you off the stage if you're sitting in front of them. Yeah. And you can't really see past them real easily too. And you want to be able to see everybody as best as you can.
Okay. Now, what age or what grade would be a good time for a student to start in the school orchestra?
In New Hanover County, we start students in 6th grade. The first experience they'll have is as a string orchestra, string ensemble, with their peers. By the time they get into high school, you've got the option and the availability of bringing in some band instruments if you're fortunate enough to have that large of an ensemble. The problem is band students and string students play in different keys. Some orchestra music is in D major. It's an extremely hard key for band instruments to play in. But they get used to it, and we get used to playing in flats. And by high school, everybody's worked out their scales, and we can put something together like that.
Okay. One more question. Where does the word orchestra come from?
Orchestra originated from the ancient Greek amphitheaters, and there was an area in the front where the choir stood, and that was called the orchestra. And that's where modern-day musicians would sit for a stage production, and that just became known as the orchestra.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us and
You're very
teaching
welcome.
us about the orchestra. When we return for our next segment, Pat Long and her student Gianna Blundo will be back with us to discuss the violin. Stay tuned for more of the Music Show.
Pop quiz for you. In what movie did I play a gang leader struggling in school? Who was my teacher? What did I learn in math class? Oh, and here's one about you. What did your kid learn in math class today?
Know what really matters. Know about your kid's school and know about your kid. Find out 100 ways to know more, do more.
Low-fat cheese sandwiches on whole wheat bread. Chewy and good for you. Snacks high in calcium help build strong bones, and foods rich in fiber are good for your heart. So you have the power to dominate. Can your food do that? Run, throw, think, eat better. Find out more at smallstep.gov.
Welcome back to the Music Show. In this segment, we're going to talk about the violin. The violin is the smallest instrument in the family of bowed string instruments that includes the violas, cellos, and double basses. It is one of the most important members of an orchestra. While the history of the violin has some unclear portions, they are very old instruments and have a large repertoire of music from many eras. The violin first appeared around 1550 as an evolution from the medieval fiddle, lira da braccio and rebec. The earliest violins have most all of the characteristics of today's violins. Although they are widely used, their design has seen very little in the way of changes over the past 400 years. Early violin making started in Italy and grew wildly. Vivaldi, a violin and composer, was among the composers of the 18th century who vastly expanded the score of the playing techniques. Later in the 1800s, the bow was perfected and completed into what is considered to be one of the most versatile instruments. The violin is found in a wide array of groups. Aside from the common orchestra, violins are also heard in styles such as bluegrass and jazz. In bluegrass, they add a fiery excitement to the music. In jazz, they add a unique contrast as soloists. Now, we welcome back to the show Pat Long and her student Gianna Blundo, who will tell us more about the violin. Welcome back.
Thank you.
My first question, and I covered this a little bit in the opening, is where did the violin originate?
Well, like it said, and like you said, the violin has gone through a lot of changes from the early records of a stringed instrument in the 800s in Asia to what we now call the modern-day violin. In the early 1500s, in the city of Cremona, Italy, there were some violin makers. There was Guarneri, who was probably the first and most famous violin maker, and then there were the Amatis. And the Stradivarius violins that you hear so much about is actually, he was a student of the Amatis, and then he started his own studio. And those are the instruments that everybody covets today. They're the ones that everybody wants. They had the most beautiful sound to them.
Okay.
Gianna has a violin here from the 1800s. This is an 1880 German violin.
Wow.
Yes, it's beautiful.
Older than all of us with
Older
our
than
ages
all of us,
combined.
that's right.
Wow. Now, what kind of materials are the violin made of?
The top is made of spruce. And why don't you turn yours over on the back, Gianna? As you can see, the back of it is, hers is a solid piece. Normally, they're like mine, and you can see that there's a rib down the middle of two pieces put together. This is the sign of a very good violin here. The sides are made of maple, and the fingerboard and pegs are made of ebony. Okay. And the scroll, the top part here, is hand carved.
Okay. Now, how about the strings? I know years ago they used to be made of one material. Are they still made of that material?
I brought a couple to show you the evolution. This is one of the major evolutions of the violin.
Okay.
Could you hold that
Sure.
for me? Thanks. This is a string that would have been on an early 1500s violin. This is made from sheep gut. And as you can see, it has a loop on the end, and it's very transparent. Mm-hmm. So this one, and you cannot order these. There's a real strict import law on animal products. So you have to be, there's a certain place that you can order them from that are certified by the government. So they're not going to just show up anywhere. But today's strings are made of steel, and they're wound, and they have an eyelet on the end now instead of a loop. And these strings can come in many different types of materials. The very thin E string is normally just a plain steel string, and the other ones are wound, which means they have a center core, and then there's a winding that goes around them real tight.
So it's really two strings, one length and then one wrapped around.
Right,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay. Now, is there any difference between the way a violin was made hundreds of years ago and the way it's made today?
No.
No difference?
Not at all.
Okay.
In fact, most of it is handwork. They do have a template now that they use to cut, and I'm sure that they had back in the days when they started. But all of the inside, the carving of the top of the Wood is all done by hand. In fact, I have a high school student who actually made a violin this year for her senior project. And she talked about how hard it was to carve it, and it gets to be so thin that you have to be so careful not to break it. And then this purfling, this area that goes around the outside, is all chiseled out and hand inlaid, all of that. It's still made very similar to when it was back then.
Do you have any idea how long it took your student to make a violin?
She is not completely done with it yet, and it's been about 4 months. So,
Okay.
and the wood itself has to age over many, many years. You don't just cut a tree and start carving on it. You cut it, dry it. It has to age for a good 10, 12 years before you even do anything with it. So it's a long process.
Very interesting. What is the difference between a violin and a fiddle? Sometimes we hear those two terms
Sure.
in the same sentence. Sometimes we hear them at different times.
There really isn't any difference.
Okay.
There may be a few minor differences that they have done, like to the bridge. Sometimes it'll be a little flatter so that you can play multiple strings at one time instead of being curved. They don't normally use a shoulder rest. The violin is held differently. That's the most difference that you'll see. Most fiddlers will hold their violin on their over their heart, and I was told by a fiddler in Ohio that they do this because the music a fiddler plays comes from their heart.
Okay.
And then a classical violinist would hold it on their shoulder.
Now, why do we have a chin rest and a shoulder rest with the guitar?
These are probably the newest additions to the violin, and yet they are about 150 years old too.
Okay.
The chin rest was added. Normally it would not have been here on a Baroque violin. It would just be a plain top, and you would hold it this way. They found that by changing the angle that the violin is held on, they could achieve more sound, and some of the techniques that they used were easier to do.
Okay.
They then added a shoulder rest that gave the violin a security on the shoulder that now they could do it hands-free. And this meant that no longer were they supporting the weight of the instrument with their hand, and their hand was free to do whatever it needed to do.
Okay. Now, what is the range of the violin? How low can it play, and up to how high can it play?
Without using harmonics, the violin can play 4 octaves, from a
Okay.
G3 to a G7.
Okay, so would you compare that to a soprano in the choir, or
Right.
Down to an alto or down to a tenor?
An alto. I wouldn't go
Okay.
as far as a tenor.
Okay.
G3 is very low soprano. C
All
is
right.
about soprano on up. So
All
you're
right.
getting mostly soprano. If you're getting into the G strings and D strings, you're in the orchestra. Your melody is probably going to be passed over to the violas.
Okay. Well, Gianna's here to play, to demonstrate the violin for us. So Gianna, would you start by demonstrating a scale on the violin? Very nice. Very nice,
It's a nice
thank
sounding
you.
instrument.
Now, if I asked you to play a fiddle tune as compared to playing a piece of classical music, what would that sound like?
You want to
Could you
demonstrate that for
demonstrate
us?
that?
Well, this is an Irish fiddle tune called Road to Liston Rana.
Very nice.
Very nice.
Very nice.
Thank you.
I saw some of the finger bends and things you see other instruments play, like some guitarists will use those finger bends and vibratos, I believe it's called.
We call those glissandos.
Glissandos, okay, all
Yep.
right. Now, like you said earlier, the fiddle and violin, there's not much difference. There's no difference in the size of a fiddle and a violin.
Nope.
Okay. Now, am I correct in that some violins come in different sizes though?
Right. We have a big advantage over band instruments. We can start children as young as 2 years of age on stringed instruments because they do come in so many different sizes. And we were just talking about this. You've seen, I haven't seen one this small, as big as our hand, all the way up to the full size. This is a full-size violin.
Okay.
And it allows us to fit the violin properly to the student, so they're not playing an instrument that's so big or too little. That it's just right.
Okay, all right. Would you please demonstrate for us a different style like you would hear with playing the violin instead of the fiddle?
Okay. Well, this is a classical piece. It's a Bach Barere.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gianna, and thank you, Pat Long.
You're very welcome.
I'd like to thank both of our guests for teaching us more about the violin and the history of the violin. And stay tuned for more of the Music Show.
Plant a tree for your tomorrow.
I can make a difference.
The Arbor Day Foundation can show you how to make a difference too. In your hands, you have the power to change our world. You can improve the environment, help your community, and build a better tomorrow. You can plant a tree. Write the National Arbor Day Foundation and support Tree City USA, where you live.
Plant a tree today for all the world to share.
What state am I?
I was the first state to ratify the U.S. Constitution in 1787. My cities are known as the chemical capitals of the world. My nickname is the Diamond State. Do you know who I am? If you guessed Delaware, you're right. I received statehood in 1787.
This United States factoid has been brought to you by New Hanover County Schools on the Learning Network of the Cape Fear.
doesn't you think?
Oh. First, you have to rinse your mouth out with warm water to clean it out. Then, use dental floss to remove any food that might be trapped between the teeth. Remember, don't place aspirin on an aching tooth or gums. And see your dentist as soon as possible.
Oh.
Feeling better, Miles?
Oh, yes.
Yay!
Eat out and eat healthy. Impossible? Not anymore. Introducing the Winner Circle Healthy Dining Program, a new statewide program designed to make eating healthy at all your favorite restaurants easy. Just look for the Star and Fork logo, and rest assured, you'll find delicious and nutritious menu choices to help keep you healthy. The Winner Circle, where nutritious meets delicious.
Welcome back to the Music Show. I hope you enjoyed that wonderful performance from the New Hanover High School Orchestra. I would like to thank Pat Long for sharing her knowledge about the orchestra and the violin with us, and would also like to thank her student Gianna Blundo for performing today. If you would like to get involved with music and learn more about music in the school system, please visit our website at www.nhcs.net/artsed, ARTSED. Once again, thanks for joining us on the Music Show, and we'll see you next time.